Normally what I do when talking about the narrative and gameplay for titles like this is discuss them chronologically and bring up anything relevant along the way. The thing is, these games are incredibly to the point. You can punch and kick with most normal combos taking out any standard thugs along the way. Webbing will take out an enemy in one go, but at the cost of your ammo and the time it takes to perform the action. The trade-off is easy to see, a few KOs at the cost of your attention and possibly some of your health being knocked down, or a melee combo that brings you up close to your foe, giving them a chance to retaliate if you're not quick to perform. What's more is how you can only hold up to 10 web cartridges at one time, so there's a price for the easier option, not to mention that web swinging and action performed by aiming Spider-Man and holding down the R2 button, also at the cost of webs. Say what you will, but I really like that idea. You have to weigh up whether or not to save your webs for a quick escape or to wrap up enemies with ease. The game never puts you in a scenario where you'd be without any way of obtaining them, or in a situation that would drain your webbing whilst in an open environment, so it's more to do with the potential of the mechanic that I like. Still, that doesn't take away the combat utilities for the web shooters. There are basic combos you can pull with your punches and kicks, but your webbing also has multiple combat uses besides the obvious. Using the directional buttons, you can fire impact webbing, web yank an enemy, create web spikes around your fist, or create a web dome. Each of these abilities are self-explanatory in terms of use, with them using up more webbing the more powerful the ability. Unfortunately, much like the basic combos you can perform, these are far from required throughout your playthrough. Spamming an attack button will do all of the work for you, leaving bosses to be the only real obstacle in the game. Damage is dealt appropriately, but the time it can take to even ready one of these attacks could be spent doing a normal round of fisticuffs that will cost you no webbing in the process. Once again, the trade-off is clear. Taking the time to perform one of these abilities can cost a consumable, and can leave you open to an enemy attack. That being said, you'll rarely be in a scenario where you'll have to worry about your webbing or even your health given the amount of pickups about in each level. The last thing I should mention before we break down the game in more detail is the traversal mechanic. Web swinging is here and it's largely used as a puzzle mechanic. Deciding on when and where to use it in open levels is fairly low risk to start off with, as it's either you can or you can't, but in chase levels later on, it becomes a matter of reading the level ahead and scanning for the best paths forwards. The praise here should go towards the level design of these sections, but I think that's best left for the level breakdowns momentarily. Along with this, you can web zip up to the ceiling above you if there is one. This is really useful during moments where stealth can be used along with a forward pull that will zip you to a wall in front of you. By pressing L1 you can aim all of these abilities to be more precise. To cover the more nitty-gritty elements, we should probably start breaking down the narrative and the levels along the way. I think we're meant to buy that this takes place within the continuity of the comics at the time of its release, or at least adjacent to it, as character designs and certain character details parallel elements from that time. For instance, Mary Jane is known as Mary Jane Parker, implying that the writers are using the established information at the time of its release, rather than going for something completely original. I honestly really like the idea of this, as it could have acted as a decent segue into the comics for newcomers, although I wouldn't quote me on this considering the state Marvel is in now. We begin this tale with a reformed Dr. Otto Octavius holding a science convention when all of a sudden Spider-Man appears on stage and steals his equipment. Peter Parker in the audience runs off to suit up as he sets off to discover the truth behind his framing. Meanwhile, Eddie Brock also witnesses the crime, causing Venom to appear and take over his body. Venom declares his anti-heroism as he sets off to trap Spider-Man. Okay, that's enough to start talking about this plot so far, I think. Something that's important to me when it comes to an adaptation of any media is that it is, in some way, accessible for newcomers. The sudden rolling of eyes that can occur whenever the words origin story appear is largely misplaced. Repetition is normally a factor for most, but it's largely on a subjective level. The reason why I'm not entirely opposed to reboots or reinterpretations of previous stories that tell the origins of certain characters like Spider-Man is largely due to it being a very core part of who he is. I know that's partially the definition of an origin story, but if we were to just jump in part way through his career, there'd better be a good reason for it instead of just that origin story was told too many times beforehand. More often than not, it's because the writers are trying to depict the defining act of that character's origin, the catalyst that brings them forwards into who they truly are. Spider-Man for the PS1 doesn't do that. In fact, its narrative depends on some prior knowledge of who several characters are, along with their motivations. It's a shame because there's already some good characterization here, specifically surrounding Venom.
You're through, Brock! When I am done with you, you won't be able to get a job taking wedding pictures in Siberia! I tried to fight it. Can't fight him anymore! Again, innocence falls prey to the evil of Spider-Man. Rest easy, Brock. Venom is here. And if it's the last thing we ever do, Jameson and the insect are gonna pay.
Dr. Octavius is neither here nor there at the moment. The general rule of thumb is that if a villain acts reformed this early on in the narrative that requires some foreknowledge, they're probably putting on an act. And yeah, the game's not too subtle about this, as we'll talk about shortly. Peter is mildly concerned about being framed, but we don't really get a lot from him either. Once again, it's Venom who shines. Eddie Brock struggles to keep himself calm when he sees Spider-Man, but Venom quickly takes over with his growling deep voice, stating that he was going to punish Spider-Man for the sake of goodness. It works a lot better if you know the character from the comics, but it's rare to see an iteration line up as well as it does here. For those who don't know, Venom is an alien symbiote that can bond with a host and feed off of their energy. The side effects to this are those strong emotions leaking out from the host, exaggerating aspects of their character that they'd otherwise keep in check. This in turn makes the symbiote more powerful. The game doesn't go that deep into it, but you can see the dynamic play out. At this point in time, Eddie knows who Spider-Man and Peter Parker are, so seeing this hero of the community commit a crime puts our dear photographer in a bit of a mood, causing Venom to snake his way out.
Innocence falls prey to the evil of Spider-Man.
That symbiotic side is on show from the get-go as Venom reasons that he's going to protect citizens from the evil Spider-Man. Meanwhile, within the shadows of New York City, two unseen figures gas the streets below. It's pretty clear who these guys are, but for the uninitiated, I'll leave it here for now. The gas is a confusing concept given how certain elements of the plot unfold, but there is a mechanical aspect I like. Let's start with the positives. The gas acts as a contextual reason for why Spider-Man is avoiding the streets below. It takes a development issue and provides context for it. Honestly, that's brilliant. But then we get into the negatives. On a number of occasions, Spider-Man is on the ground when fighting against Rhino and Venom. Along with this, the gas is only mentioned as an issue less than a handful of times. In fact, most of New York seems to be going about their business as if it doesn't even exist. Moving forwards with the plot, Spider-Man meets with Black Cat, who helps advise him when taking down the Jade Syndicate, thus opening the first level. This is our first example of an open level where the emphasis is on platforming from building to building in order to reach our destination. The main issue with these levels is how they can be brute force simply because most standard enemies can't keep up with you when web swinging. Aiming towards a building and scaling it and then repeating the process as fast as possible will yield quick and successful results. At the very least, I can say that this is the start of the game. Optional tutorials are littered everywhere and are provided by Black Cat, but you can tackle these situations at your own pace. In many ways, it negates the aforementioned issue because it encourages the player to experiment anywhere they want. The only requirement is reaching the end of the level. The result is a pretty decent tutorial. I'm not normally someone who would complain about the game interrupting me at the start to teach me something, because I believe it's often better to explain the fundamentals as much as possible to the player early on. Being caught out because you didn't know or understand how a mechanic in a game works simply because the game didn't teach you, or rather give you the opportunity to be taught, is just always on the game and not the player. At the same time, the argument can be made for allowing the player to experiment on their own and suffer the consequences for not having paid attention, or to bypass the tutorial if you've already been through it before. This snugly fits into the latter. You can go into each mechanic as deep as you want, or just beeline for the exit. Platforming is extremely simple at this stage, as most buildings have flat rooftops and are only slightly elevated in comparison to each other, so it really is just a matter of getting to the end. Combat encounters are littered in between, but the thugs all go down with a basic combo, so they're only there for the uninitiated. Closing in on the bank will start up the second level, which isn't too dissimilar to the first. Buildings are more varied in height, especially the bank itself, with militarized Jade Syndicate members at the top. They still go down with a single combo, so it's not that much more of a challenge. You have to take these guys out in order to proceed, but it's not very intense. I know we're moving fast here, but it's largely because the first few levels aren't very layered in terms of depth. In fact, some levels in this game can last a minute or two if you know what you're doing, and I don't consider that to be a bad thing entirely, as they're only the tutorial sections that act like this. Sort of, kind of, we'll get to it, don't worry. The third level is where we're introduced to the stealth and crawling around on the ceiling. You can bypass some situations by sticking to the walls, or you can web up them at the cost of your cartridges. Guards will react slightly if they see someone being taken down, but they're not intelligent enough to look up for Spidey. Hostages are about the place, and you have to take care of the goons to free them, whilst using vents to navigate around areas you otherwise couldn't. It's more set up for future levels again, but it doesn't go unappreciated, as the game will rarely point out which way is the right way to go. You'll see a vent panel on the floor, and that will be a clue to look up, where you'll find an opening. Opening a few switches will then reveal the path to an elevator where the level will end. The fourth and final level of this first mission arc starts with the same as the previous mission, until you enter an open room with some furniture. Whilst you were capable of doing this beforehand, you are now prompted to pick up objects and throw them. Spider-Man moves slower when he's holding an object, but the trade-off to speed is a heavy attack that reaches a far distance. It's fine enough, but I rarely found myself using this ability because of how quick Spider-Man was. In the latter levels, I could understand it. It definitely works out well in later boss fights, but there's no real use for it unless you're absolutely too nervous to go up and engage in a normal round of fisticuffs. There's a security checkpoint which can be squeezed past to avoid alerting guards, and activating a bomb, which is our next objective. Hostages, goons, and a bomb lie within the next two rooms, along with a series of switches that unlock the door to the bomb and hostages, as well as another that unlocks a vault. The guards will notice you at some point, which is when they'll activate the bomb, leading to a countdown. Easy enough, take out the guards and put the bomb into the vault. You can throw the bomb to get it there faster, but then the countdown will start moving faster as well. Either way, you'll have more than enough time to get the bomb in and close the vault. All in all, it's a solid start, setting the expectation for the rest of the game. Whilst it may not be mechanically rich or narratively deep, it paves the way for things to evolve as the game goes on. Some swinging, punching, wall crawling, and environmental puzzle solving. Saying that stuff by themselves does showcase the objective quality of those elements, but we're at a stage where they have plenty of time and room to expand. I believe that every element of a game should be judged equally despite the length of those pieces within the overall experience. Objectively, there is no reason why the game's every mechanic and level shouldn't always match its high points, but when we're starting from neutral territory and hovering around the area, then my critique is going to match that as well. The narrative we're given at the start isn't particularly relevant just yet, but a police helicopter during the second level keeps the idea that those events are still in play. If we're being honest, there is no reason as to why this game couldn't have opened up on its third act of levels, gameplay-wise, as it's only then when we start getting the ball moving with what's being established. An argument could be made that if we remove the opening cutscene, the game could have played out and we'd still get a decent idea of what's going on. By not having Peter Parker at the conference and just being Spider-Man, we are experiencing the first two level arcs as if they were just a day in the life of the character. After stopping the Jade Syndicate, Spidey could go on to stop Scorpion in the next mission, only for the twist of the police being after him to be when the curtain drops on a larger scheme underway. The police chase coming up is no longer a ticking clock that we, as the player, are expecting, but rather the inciting incident that kicks the whole thing off. There is an added layer of mystery behind everything now, and it would at least make a little more sense that Spider-Man didn't just leave the conference at the start of the game and go on as if nothing had happened for a little bit. That being said, we should move on to the next set of levels. Race to the Bugle acts as a shift in difficulty from what we had in the tutorial level from the start. We are in familiar territory now, but we're working under the clock. Scorpion is etching closer and closer to Jameson, and we have to get there before he does. The stakes are high, and the banter that the player can hear between them generally makes the atmosphere way more tense.
Get away, Gargan!
Your time is running out.
The manual explains every character's motivations throughout, but I can imagine that for the player that would skip that sort of thing, learning that Jameson is the reason why Gargan is in the Scorpion suit might be a little strange. It's a matter of third-party information because the game itself just offhandedly throws it out there, and I honestly don't know how knowledgeable most new players will be about this sort of stuff. The general rule of thumb should always be never expect the player knows what a die-hard fan does. Yes, a fan is more likely to pick up this game, but if a newcomer were to try this back in the day to get into the franchise itself, then I'm not sure how alienating this would be. Jameson gets enough of an introduction from Eddie Brock's perspective at the start of the game, but we've moved from a dude who dresses up in tights and traverses using his own webbing, along with a buff woman who dresses like a cat, to a guy in a high-tech Scorpion suit. I'm beyond perplexed as to what a newcomer would think past this point, but I suppose it would be a matter of you're either in or out. If we're assuming that most newcomers to the series picked this up around the time it came out, then at least the manual provides some descriptions of each character once again. There's not too much to say about this level, as it mimics a lot of the elements from the second rooftop level from the first arc of missions. The countdown is the defining factor here, and I think the mixture of that along with the aesthetic change, thanks to the colouring being night-themed, is enough to make this distinctive. You had your time to play about with the mechanics, so now you have to put those skills to the test. Reaching the Bugle will initiate our first boss fight, and they're messy. The redeeming factor for most of the bosses in the game are the environmental mechanics that you can interact with to make things easier should you know where to look thanks to some decent visual clues. Going toe-to-toe with them will lead to negative results. You can dish out the damage, but this isn't Dark Souls. Telegraphing attacks is next to off the menu here, as you'll often have no time to react before you're flung across the arena. For Scorpion's stage, you can use the furniture to deal some large damage without getting too close to alert him. The risk here is that Jameson will be hiding around the room, and if you're not in Scorpion's face, he will find and deal damage to him. The boss takes this back and forth dance routine between managing where Scorpion is and not getting too close as to take a lot of damage from him. The level is short and sweet, so any issues it does have don't linger. There is an element of attention the player needs to have in order to get through it as well, although I'd be lying if I said that the brute force approach won't present successful results. It's just more of a riskier game, and I'm grateful that the game doesn't incentivize it just yet. It should be mentioned that the level does change halfway through as the fight is taken into another room. It's smaller, but the challenge isn't greater because of it. A few slaps to the face later, and while Scorpion might be out of the count, JJ calls the cops on Spider-Man, leading to the rest of this series of levels. 5 back-to-back levels that all equate to a chase scene between Spider-Man and a police chopper. Initially I saw these levels as fairly repetitive, but I've grown to appreciate them since. The point is that the chopper is meant to tire you out. The chase is relentless, going from rooftops that are familiar and eventually leading into a construction site and then across a series of cranes. If it wasn't for the loading screen, this would be a really impressive set piece overall. That's not to say it's not, but I think there's an element of feeling that New York is a large and interconnected city that's lost whenever a level fades out. It works decently up until this point because we are, for the most part, traversing the same environment just under different circumstances and a change in time of day. It adds a layer that makes this world feel dynamic without it needing to be visually. There's enough going on between each section of the set piece that makes the levels feel somewhat interlinked, but it's clear what's going on here. Each level is dedicated to another part of the chase that's based around a unique mechanic. Going from rooftop to rooftop whilst evading missiles in one level and then scaling a building doing the same in the next. Suddenly, verticality is introduced as you have to scale an unstable construction site via the structure's weak beams only to proceed into the next level and have traversal play out across some narrow cranes without the safety net of a building below you like in the previous levels. There's one thing I'll keep coming back to here, and that's how good the difficulty curve is. With a single glance, you may consider each level to be another experimental what will stick kind of approach, but it's only when you take a step back and view the game as a whole when you can see what's happening. We've traversed rooftops before and even under a time limit, but now we're doing the same with time limit being an approaching helicopter that will shoot us down or blow us up if we're slow to act. The escalation of previous levels is still here, just with a different coat of paint. Even then, what originally will look like minute mechanical challenges are really just continuations of previous set pieces, whilst setting the stage for future ones. Climbing a building whilst avoiding more missiles and gunfire is taking what we've learned already, but meshing it in a way that the game hasn't tried out yet. Then the game merges that vertical nature in a way where the environment is fighting against you, but with a safety net below in case you screw up. All accumulating with the final level of this set that merges everything together. It is an everything and the kitchen sink approach, but it's done in a way that doesn't start the player. Each piece is set up before the chaos is unleashed at the end. If we were starting with the final level, I'd say this is all too much in one go, but that's the thing, this isn't all in one go. At least not right away. What I'll say about this title going forward, there is one thing that's certain: the directions and concepts for this game are realised to near perfection. This is how accessibility is done right, holding the player's hand before loosening your grip as the title proceeds. There's never a moment where we're not learning something new before it's overlaid with things that have already been taught to us. The standards are high, and there is another direction this game hasn't delved deeper into yet: combat and puzzles. Before that, we have to talk about Rhino and Venom. The Rhino boss acts as his own self-contained section to remove Black Cat from the table. There's not much more to say than that plot-wise, except that this is one of two sections where we're on ground level, and the air is just fine despite the gas or fog that supposedly made the ground inaccessible. Black Cat gets bashed by Rhino before the fight starts, which is okay. The four electrical pillars in the centre of the arena are a big giveaway, and you'll learn that Rhino will only charge you when you're in his direct line of sight. Get him to charge and move behind a pillar to deal a chunk of damage as you dish out some of your own. Rinse and repeat, and then the boss is over. You can use the walls to stun him for a bit without the added damage, but this is really a scenario that speaks for itself. I only say it's just okay because there's nothing much else to add. It functions and uses some level of skill from the player in regards to them judging the distance and timing they have when egging Rhino on. Past that, it's pretty simple and adds little more than another level to the game. At this point, you might have noticed that I've stopped talking about the plot, and that's largely because it's a lot of stop and starting. An inciting incident happens and we play it out. It's all connected and comes together as a larger plot momentarily. Let me go over what's happened so far and you'll understand. After taking down the Jade Syndicate, Scorpion then attacks Jameson and Spider-Man goes to stop him. It gives Jameson a chance to call the police, starting off the chase we mentioned before. Spider-Man encounters Daredevil, who interrupts him fleeing and questions his innocence. Using his ability as a human lie detector, he learns that Spidey is in the clear and tells him that he'll relay the message to the other heroes. Would have been nice if he told the police as well, and yes, that is a flaw with the narrative. One chase sequence later, he meets up with Black Cat, who informs him that Rhino is on the loose and Venom has kidnapped his wife, MJ. No issues with that, so let's keep on moving. Venom takes control of a Jumbotron to taunt Spider-Man, and I generally don't know whether this is terrifying, funny, or dumb. Venom would have had to find a way to lure Spider-Man, so I guess this is as good away as any, but also, what about the police that were on his tail? Being the smart man that he is, Spider-Man chooses to deal with Rhino first. Okay, granted, he does say it's on his way to Venom, and that Rhino is attacking a power plant, but his wife's life is at risk, and there's no real hesitation to hold back just a second before rescuing her. Spider-Man and Black Cat arrive at the plant where Rhino busts up Black Cat. We beat his ass, only for Spider-Man to find out that the people taking Black Cat aren't paramedics, but goons kidnapping her. Instead of setting out to rescue her from the ambulance or rescuing his wife, Spider-Man vents to the Human Torch, who reiterates that Spidey should really get on with Venom. It's an excuse to throw in more New York Marvel heroes, and to be honest, I do appreciate this happening more than not for the time being. And speaking of timing, that timing is just a little off of this. And that brings us up to date. We now get a chase sequence with Venom, and I'm a little mixed on this as well. It's another variation of the rooftop set levels we've done before, but this time we're actively chasing someone. The room for error is tight, but not all the time. Venom has a few points where he'll stop and wait for Spider-Man, but then there are times where he'll just charge to his next routed area. As long as you follow him directly, this isn't a hard time, but if you do have to question why you would lose Venom in the first place if it's a part of his plan for Spider-Man to follow him. Reaching the end of the level will start up our first fight against Venom, and it's unfortunately dull once again. Using your web spikes will deal a lot of damage, but he can dish out just as much. Health pickups are a near must because he can place you in states where you can't break free on a regular basis. It's hard to read someone who's invisible half the fight. Still, there's a good chance that you'll defeat him quickly, in which he'll flee into the sewers below where Spidey gives chase. As mentioned previously, traversal-centric levels are largely gone now, so combat environmental puzzles are the focus for the next batch. The sewers are a tedious affair, simply because trial and error is introduced into the puzzle sections. Starting off things pretty simple. Lizardmen are introduced and they act as the next step up in enemy difficulty. Web spikes are the go-to here, or the web shield if you get overwhelmed, but they will go down with 2 sets of a normal combo. Their numbers are the thing to look out for, as, if unchecked, they can quickly swarm you and deal lots of damage fast. I'd say that the pipes are the challenge in the first part due to how thin they are, and there being enemies on them, but you can easily bypass the enemies, and the auto-targeting with the web swing will handle the rest. Take care of the final set of Lizardmen, and the introductory level will come to an end. It's not good, but it's certainly not bad. Relying on heavy hitters to provide a challenge can always be a mixed bag with game design. Raising a damage value isn't interesting as changing up the way the player has to think when engaging with an enemy. The saving grace here is how the web shield becomes increasingly more effective the more enemies appear. This goes for the other web abilities as well, although it's not to the degree where I'd say merely using those abilities makes the encounters more interesting. It's a button press that rarely requires any timing. It works and I'd prefer this over nothing, but it's not as if the player is being tested intellectually. All of the web abilities work against these guys, so it's not even a matter of which one is more effective. The only thing I could really add to these combat sections is that the web conservation is now more a priority than ever, and it's not as if that's too big an issue, as the cartridges are still easy to find. The sewer cavern is another round of A to B, with little interesting to say about the level design. I'd say that the pipes are a decent inclusion as they encourage you to use your manual targeting in order to swing from one to another, but the only risk here is your patience. Subway is one of the more forgettable levels. I think that the developers were trying to replicate the tension of the Scorpion race, but in the form of a combat gauntlet. You have to stay alive until the end. I did mention that the Lizardmen are slightly more difficult than the average goon, but we're on a train and a basic combo will send them flying off. Their numbers are kept to a sensible level throughout, so this is really a waiting game. The following level might just be the worst level in the game. Sewage Plant is another A to B mission, but this time it's down to linear corridors with groups and groups of Lizardmen. The actual objective of this mission is to set the water level to the exit low enough to traverse through. Press the appropriate switches and fend off against the enemies swarming you, and you'll get through just fine. The puzzle aspect isn't particularly challenging, and I'd say the combat isn't tedious except you've fought against these guys plenty now. Okay, I should rephrase, it's less about the amount of times you've fought against the Lizardmen, and it's more to do with the scenarios they're placed in. The regular guards and Jade Syndicate members were patrolling rooftops and setting up hostages. There was more going on, and it meant that there was a layer of multitasking required in order to proceed comfortably. Here the game sort of shrugs and throws more Lizardmen at you when things get a little too quiet. There's nothing narrative-wise going on here either, so it's not even like we've gained some kind of motivation to get through all of this outside of MJ's capture. Yeah, that's a pretty big deal for Peter, but I think that it should be noted that the player should have a level of investment in this as well. This barely feels like a chase on top of everything else purely because Spider-Man is being strung along by Venom, which is still so strange to me because his plan depends on Peter not dying or getting lost. We are given a loose idea as to why this is happening later on, but it feels like the developers are trying to cram in Spider-Man's greatest hits. It sort of works when the reason is sound, but the one we're given for Venom in particular only works on a surface level. Speaking of levels, I take what I said about Sewage Plant back being the worst. Hidden Switches is here for some reason, padding methinks. I say this because the objective is to press 4 switches in order. The thing is, it's a tight room and the switches reveal themselves in the order they need to be pressed. It's a dot-to-dot but with Lizardmen. Once they've been activated, the exit to the level opens up. I get the feeling this was meant to be a gauntlet of sorts, with you fighting waves of Lizardmen in between switches, but considering you get nothing for beating them, you can easily jump past them and finish this level in a minute or two. Tunnel Crawl fares a bit better, if only because the environment takes centre stage rather than yet more hordes of scalies. Simply time your crawls with the water descending and proceed to the next safe zone before it rises. It ends with you pressing a switch to lower some water to press another switch to reach the level's exit. I'll say that at least the stop and start is on the player this time around, instead of the game throwing more enemies at you to stretch out the length of the level. Venom's puzzle feels the most out of place for a section. 4 gates close behind him, and in order to open them we have to press the right switches. Sound familiar? Sort of. This is the best puzzle level yet, and it's mainly due to the player having to pay attention to what switch does what. Some open one door, and some open 2. Get the right combination and you can proceed. It's not complex, but it succeeds at keeping the player engaged. The puzzle-isms come to a head with the Lizard's Maze, and this could easily be the best level in the game. I know, a quick 180 from the doom and gloom of earlier stuff. Venom is playing a game of hot and cold with you. Go the wrong way and he'll get a free hit. That being said, Venom wants you to chase him, and this is the first time where it shows. He actively taunts Spider-Man throughout and will warn the player if they're too carefree about their directions. The Lizard himself can be found in the middle, and he'll explain that he's been caged up by Venom. As revenge, he'll give you directions based off the environment up ahead. As you crawl past machinery and burst pipes, you'll see something I didn't quite expect from this game. I assume the developers will say it's paint, but Venom starts to indicate whether we're close or not by taunting us, breathing down our necks, occasionally appearing to remind us that he's still there, and by writing the word warm in a red substance. Yeah, this still creeps me out when playing this today, and this level is close to one of my favourite Venom moments in all of media. The low draw distance, and him appearing just out of sight, but the sound cue of him decloaking is horrifying in this context. It's the only time during his run where Venom feels like he's fully in control, and I wish we had more of this instead of Lizard Royale.
Starting to sweat here, Parker?
We end this level with another round of fisticuffs against Venom, only this time we also have to protect Mary Jane. Several switches are located about the level, and Venom will often cloak and activate one, raising the water levels of where Mary Jane is chained up. This is another example of the game pulling a 180 from earlier. He still cloaks himself, but with the knowledge of where the switches are, we can guess his location. Take too long, and he'll start flooding Mary Jane, meaning that you have to divert your attention to the correct switch. With the switch activated, Venom will also direct his attention to you, meaning that the game of cat and mouse is still happening. Take damage during your attempt to find the right switch, and you'll have to divert your attention again to find a health pickup due to the heavy damage Venom deals. The room is small enough to always have a visual on Venom's whereabouts, making it solely on the player if they don't make it in time. Fail to pay attention again, and you'll be punished. It's a really good fight overall, as it mixes a little of everything we've learned so far, including the boss fight from earlier. Right, where to begin? A mixture of combat and puzzles on display here, and this arc is a real mixed bag for it. The Lizardmen aren't complex. They have double the damage of basic thugs at the start of the game, and they're only intimidating in numbers, or rather frustrating. Tedium is subjective, but repetition can still be executed poorly if the approach is simply more and more. In this case, that's exactly what they are. Take a few steps and more will appear. Take a few more and another group will hobble from around the corner. This wouldn't be an issue if the levels themselves had more going for them. The problem is that half of them really don't. Flicking a switch to open a door isn't a puzzle. Placing enemies in front of the switch doesn't make matters more complicated, just more. Now, making it a matter of which switch is the right one with a visual indicator is more than just more. It's getting the player to learn a mechanic to proceed. Sure, you can brute force it, but that method could cost you significantly more time. Cap this off with a genuinely chilling sequence characterizing Venom as sadistically as the game can without destroying that age rating, and then give the player a tense fight using more of what they've learned so far. The lowest lows meet the highest highs, and unfortunately what follows is the same. Spider-Man isn't too pleased Venom tried to drown his wife, and his reasoning for it doesn't make things better. Eddie fell for the fake Spider-Man trick and decided to punish a potential thief by murdering his wife. I haven't mentioned this as of yet, but as fond as I am of the police chase from earlier, one still has to wonder why they saw a thief and decided to open fire on most of the city. Yeah, you might have thought that I've just forgotten about the police chopper that fired rockets into skyscrapers and office buildings, potentially killing hundreds of civilians, but then we come back to Venom's response and it somewhat seems tame in comparison. The monster that rampaged through New York kidnapped Peter's wife and lured him out with PG blood that we could assume at this point was MJ's, but the cops with Gatling guns firing into the city without remorse, and even their own men, get a pass apparently. It's clear Neversoft were going for a tone and spectacle over what was actually happening, and it really makes sequences like this fall flat in retrospect. Of course, that doesn't diminish the performance of Rino Romano's perfectly delivers what Spider-Man would be like on the brink.
Why, Venom? Why did you come back?
You should know, Spider-Man. The heist you pulled at the Science Expo. You're the bad guy this time.
You idiot! Think, Eddie. Think back to that day.
You and your wife are innocent, Parker. Our bad.
Our bad? Our bad? I'm gonna kill you!
Parker! Just get me!
Let's not forget Darren Norris's haunting take on Venom during the Lizard's Maze.
If you can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen, Parker. Ugh, cool as ice. Tasty. Starting to sweat here, Parker? Ah, you're on fire, baby. Ah, ooh, you're hot, baby.
I'm saying this all right now because the next part is rough.
But only for now. After we bust those tech thieves, it's payback time for kidnapping my wife.
Jeez, one little mistake. We said we're sorry.
Venom's anti-hero, or rather anti-villain approach, is in character for what we know of him. he managed to set up everything we've been through in the sewers, including imprisoning the lizard. So why does Neversoft immediately turn him into a bumbling baboon after he's told he's done wrong? This is humiliating for the character. I wouldn't say it's out of line with what this game shows of him entirely, but I definitely didn't picture the guy who did be turned into...
Ooh, we know!
Who?
The Submariner.
Submariner.
The larger plan at hand unravels as Peter and Eddie realise they've been pitted against each other. On the surface, I get it. Eliminate them both by pitting them against each other, but what happens when one wins or this exact scenario plays out? The big baddies now have two angry powerhouses heading for them. I sure hope a genius and a known serial killer aren't behind this, otherwise their characters might be in the dust too. I'm going to throw out another piece of dialogue that bugged me a little more since hearing it back a few times during the editing process.
Now, the imposter was a shapeshifter, so that means it was either Mysterio or the Chameleon.
There's two sides to this that have gotten me, but I'll save one of them for the next chapter. For now, let's discuss the shapeshifter part. I think the instant dismissal of Chameleon threw me off so much that I forgot to focus on the obvious. Why does the imposter have to be a shapeshifter? The Spider-Man costume is exactly that, it's a costume. A well-documented costume in hundreds of pictures on the front of a popular newspaper on a near-constant basis. A costume that is meant to hide someone's identity. Suggesting that the imposter is a superpowered or magical shapeshifter seems a bit overkill in my eyes. The bar is set to person wearing a mask, and Spider-Man leap to superpowered being with the ability to morph their entire body. I'll get back onto this in a little bit, but the need to fast-track the narrative without putting in the work is starting to get a little much. The duo decide to stick together and head to the Daily Bugle to access their database for more information. To say things escalate quickly would be an understatement. At least there's more build-up than Insomniac's take on this. Yeah, it's the go-to arc, Symbiote Invasion. The convenience of the Bugle being their breeding ground isn't lost on me, nor is the fact that the answer to one of this narrative's biggest mysteries, pun intended. Let's focus on the symbiote part first. We're in the final third of the game now, and aside from Carnage's involvement, a symbiote invasion seems like a jump from what we've had before. This gets crazier in a moment, so for now, let's break this chapter down. Arriving at the Bugle tips Venom off to Carnage's presence, compelling him to hunt Carnage down. This, I like. If Carnage is the one spreading his, goo, then it makes sense for Venom to detect his offspring. The symbiotes detecting each other and planning around Spider-Man is something I can always buy into because of Venom's defining traits. This is another thing that requires outsiders' knowledge, but it's established early on that Venom's time with Peter allowed him to become familiar with his scent, and for Peter's spider sense to not recognize Venom as a threat. Carnage is an extension to Venom, so any plan he concocts that requires him to skulk around is more plausible than most of Spider-Man's roster. Flooding the city with gas also helps to distract from something as large as the Bugle being taken over. Of course, this can excuse several other factors under one very large condition. Venom coming to the surface far easier than one might imagine can be contributed to Carnage's presence having an effect. Pitting both Spider-Man and Venom together not only gets Spider-Man out of the way, but distracts Venom from acting on Carnage. At least, for long enough. So what's that very large condition? The game actually needs to address this. It's law appropriate, and fixes most of Venom's involvement, but we're still going under the assumption that this is in line with the comics and not within its own continuity. That doesn't excuse how obscure this information is to a casual audience member. However, Scorpion, Rhino, the Lizard and Venom are all somewhat recognisable within the mainstream, but it seems to be only at face value. If the Venom trilogy and Insomniac's Marvel's Spider-Man 2 are anything to go by, the original character of Venom is lost to time. If a character like Venom has become so misunderstood, then what the chances Carnage will be any different? The rule for the symbiotes bypassed for the sake of a slightly more evil Red Venom. These aren't suits that just make a person evil. They're also not completely separate entities to their hosts. They have personalities of their own, but learn from their hosts. The circumstances for Venom's attachment to both Peter and Eddie is tragic, but a tale that went about as well as it could have. Venom latched onto Peter's need to protect and saw it as a need for strength. Already fueled by this, anger towards Peter's independence and Eddie's jealousy of Peter's success evolved that being into the creature we should know as Venom. Of course, Eddie isn't all bad. His emotions were being played with as well. Venom was like a child lashing out at the world he didn't understand. So in time, he did. Not entirely forgiven for his actions, Eddie learned how to tame the creature. That is the Venom missing from the mainstream. This game sort of gets that. It's a shame there's no acknowledgement of it because it would go a long way towards making this portrayal even more special. Instead, we're left drifting between what we have here and what we could have had if only a sentence or two was added. I can't praise what doesn't exist, so within the context of this game, Venom shows up, kidnaps Mary Jane, helps Spider-Man, and vanishes after Carnage. Not because it makes sense for him to do these things, but because the plot demands it. So what's left over? Let's find out. The first level is simple enough. Symbiotes are kidnapping people to turn them into hosts. We have to break them out by turning on the AC units around the Bugle. We're back in the Jade Syndicate territory, in the sense that these levels are similar in style to those. Traverse by using vents and press buttons to free prisoners. What's the difference then? The symbiotes. They pack a punch, and on your first go at fighting them, you'll find very little of their telegraphing fare. They're immune to all web attacks apart from the web spikes. Why? The game doesn't give us a reason, so I guess there is none. Of course, there is a loose reason why to something adjacent in the comics, but that's not relevant here. How does beating them up go? To start off with, terribly. Their wind-up attacks, I kid you not, have invincibility frames. This means that if they're preparing to whack you, you better leap away before your health bar is drastically depleted. You have to hope that they're not in the middle of an animation, otherwise you'll whiff every attack you'll throw at them. It's repetitive, screws you with muscle memory, and worst of all, it's visually lying to you. There is no contextual reason as to why I shouldn't land these punches. Rescuing the captive and exiting the level will place Spidey on a long elevator ride that requires you simply whack symbiotes off, press a switch, open a door, and that's it. Most enemy encounters can be avoided by just standing still. It's not particularly involving, and it's far too uneventful for its premise. Next up is the paper presses and symbiote generators. I don't know about this. This is actually the breaking point for the narrative, by the way. Everything that came before could have been explained away in some shape or form. I'm not sure I can excuse artificially creating symbiotes. They explode once you hit both blobs on either side, so I assume that means some level of organic materials involved, but to what degree? You can't tell me that Carnage left some of himself behind on each generator, right? What would be left of him? The alternative would be Carnage used the generator to make an artificial symbiote to then clone and make more to place on other generators. What does that mean to massively distill a symbiote? It can't be 100%, because surely some part of the process requires something other than symbiote for the cloning process to happen. Otherwise, why have the generators? We're in the land of, no, trust me bro. And to be honest, I won't act like I didn't see this coming. It's aimed towards kids mentality, and it affects a lot of fictional media as a scapegoat. Pulling from Spider-Man's vast series of comics and then saying that they can be just as broken only tells me that they're just as broken. It's not a defense, and it frustrates me because I know that this can be done right. For now, let's just move on. Blow up the generators and head for the exit. If you haven't guessed it, by this point, we are in the combat section of the game. Venom's chapter dabbled with this, but focused more on its puzzles. The symbiotes spawn infinitely until you deal with their generators, so the emphasis is on numbers rather than strategy. Punch, 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 and move on. You can find magnesium webbing here as a temporary buff, but to be honest, you might as well bypass the symbiotes every chance you get. The Bugle's basement is the same, but in a straight path. You can open up the furnaces to knock the symbiotes into, but this is more trouble than it's worth. Occasionally a pipe will burst with hot steam, but for the most part, these can also be ignored. There's not really much to say about these levels overall. I don't think they're bad. The lizard men still take the cake for the most annoyingly placed enemy, and at least even when the symbiotes spawn in, the game limits the amount to something reasonable for their damage output. The challenge of not using webbing is fine enough, but the web spikes still dish out more than the regular attacks, so it doesn't entirely add up. The furnaces are a great environmental idea to combat the symbiotes, but there's never enough of the slimy buggers to encourage that use in the first place. Yeah, I'm saying it. This was their opportunity to go with the spam. Regardless of the enemy type, a base combo will always end with some knockback, so throwing more of these guys at Spidey or making them a little buffer would have been fine by me. Anyways, we come face to face with Spidey's doppelganger, and it's Mysterio. We have one chapter left, and then I can finally address the elephant in the room with this roster, but for now we can talk about the imposter plot a little more. At this point, Venom, Chameleon, Carnage and Mysterio have all been mentioned, along with the symbiotes in general. What's one thing they all have in common? They can morph and shapeshift at will. Let's talk about the purpose of these characters being in the narrative so far. Venom is brought in as a distraction for Spider-Man, whilst Carnage goes about his business. Chameleon is brought up as an example of who the perpetrator could be. Carnage is looking to be this game's big bad, and Mysterio is here to pretend to be Spider-Man. I don't know if you can tell where I'm going with this yet. Basically, we can trim the fat. Mentioning a shapeshifter in the first place muddies the water to an extent this narrative really doesn't need. The amount that can do that within Spider-Man's rogue gallery alone is overwhelming, let alone the wider Marvel Universe, which this game has no issue with addressing. The focus is on the what and not the why. Spider-Man is searching for someone who can change their appearance because someone dressed up as him. Even if we were to ask the question, who would want to frame Spider-Man, it would be too much. So, what would be the solution here? Keep Venom if you absolutely must, but remove the Chameleon mention and Mysterio entirely. Venom and Carnage are the only ones needed for this to work. Next up, don't show us Eddie casually in public. This is the post-Venom world, and enough people would have connected the dots to who he is, given the rampage. Eddie is disguised and taking pictures as an attempt to salvage a sense of normality in his life and earn some money on the side. Most people at the Bugle will have known about Peter and Eddie's rivalry somewhat, so have the imposter on stage be Peter and not Spider-Man. There's a lot of work to do with the narrative going forward thanks to this change, but it is possible. Having everything within the first chapter play out the same, next up, Scorpion. He's sent to the Bugle to assassinate anyone that could corroborate Peter's alibi. This makes the timing and purpose of Scorpion's assault reasonable and less of a convenience. Maybe Scorpion lets something loose about his link to Peter being framed, and whilst J. Jonah Jameson isn't on good terms with Spider-Man, during these dark times he tells him to look out for the kid. Maybe show a news advertisement for the Bugle's paper that attempts to restore Peter's reputation. Eddie is still unconvinced, and through Carnage's presence, Venom resurfaces, seeing this as a chance to take down his greatest foe, and to instead restore Eddie's reputation, maybe even in an effort to be seen as New York's true protector. Going back to Spider-Man, he is chased, not by the rampaging police, but the remaining members of the Jade Syndicate wanting to take revenge for their heist gone wrong, along with trying to fulfill the contract with their boss. Spider-Man and Peter Parker being attacked on both fronts. This comes to a head when Venom lures Spider-Man out by kidnapping his wife MJ. Maybe explain Venom's capturing of the Lizard as less of a cruel act and more of a hint towards something here isn't as it seems. After all, the Lizard is caged but unharmed, almost as if Eddie and his darker side are trying to turn a page. Still, Peter can't get past his wife's capture and proceeds after Venom. Once in his lair, Peter finds MJ chained up against a wall and not a pit with rising water. Venom appears and demands Peter admit his crimes, but Spider-Man's temper is shortened with MJ's kidnapping, and Venom's animalistic instincts take over, causing the two to brawl. The two are close to finishing each other, only for Peter to notice that Venom is pulling his punches. This isn't the monster he's faced before. MJ finally gets through to them by claiming that Eddie seemed more remorseful over his actions and that Venom should know better because of his prior bond with Peter. The two talk it out, concluding that Venom wouldn't have resurfaced so easily without a trigger. Spider-Man and Venom conclude that the only thing that could encourage such a transformation has the ability to shapeshift, knows Peter's identity, and would want him dead, is the one and only Carnage, the symbiote offspring of Venom retaining the scent and knowledge of Spider-Man's true identity. As the revelation comes forth, J. Jonah Jameson attempts to check in on Peter over the phone, only for Carnage's symbiote invasion to begin. With that, we have amended a good chunk of the narrative, given Scorpion and Venom a purpose outside of being lucky additions to Carnage's plan, along with giving several characters an arc of sorts. It's not airtight, but it works a lot better than the cameo fest we have going on here, along with the copious amounts of lampshading. There's one additional change I'd like to make before this is over, and we'll get to that shortly. Let's continue on with the actual plot for the time being. So yeah, Mysterio was behind the heist. His reasoning? He's a bad guy. See why I removed him from this? If you want something deeper, then you won't be satisfied by his 3 minutes of screen time. That's a minute and a half before his fight, where he reveals himself, and a minute and a half afterwards where he says, "I'll never tell you my boss's secret plan to start a symbiote invasion."
Right now you're thinking, if only you'd taken that giant act to Vegas instead.
Curse your endless babble, Spider-Man!
Speaking of babble, let's hear it. Who's behind all this?
I'll never tell you! Mysterio may be defeated, but the symbiote invasion cannot be stopped!
Symbiote invasion? There are more of them?
You fool! There will be more than you can imagine! That fog which blankets the city is preparing everyone in New York for symbiosis!
You're the fool, Mysterio! Where? Where are they coming from?
Go then! On the waterfront! Warehouse 65. A secret passage. If only I could watch them destroy you.
Whoever your boss is, he's off his rocker! No one can control the symbiotes.
Correction! No one before now!
Spare me the propaganda, okay? This isn't a game, Mysterio. The symbiotes will destroy everything in their path unless I can stop them.
Thanks, game. The fight with Mysterio isn't the weakest in the game, but I wouldn't call it anything more than just serviceable. There are 4 layers of platforms, and 3 of them have 2 sets of targets to shoot with your impact webbing. Simply jump out of the way of Mysterio's swipes and kicks and leap over the spiked barrels in your way. The major difference between this fight and the others in the game is that Mysterio has 2 health bars. Destroy all of the targets and he'll replace the 2 on the top layer with 2 more that emit lasers. Jump over the lasers, blow up the new targets, and then fire at his dome. It keeps you active, but most of the fight is a spectacle over substance. A fight doesn't need to be complex, but when you break down what it asks of the player, you can start to assess it on a level that isn't, whoa, this is pretty cool, because he's big. Ha. For each layer, you jump and then fire impact webbing, rinse and repeat. The timing for Mysterio's attacks are all the same, and so is the response the player must enact to get through. I'll say that the telegraphing is great. The fight may not ask much, but the visual cues are perfect. I'd probably have it so that each layer of the fight required a different reaction to get by or a different offensive maneuver. Maybe have some symbiotes guard his legs, so you need to use fire webbing to burn them off. The 5th chapter of the game struggles plot-wise, but it's fine in the gameplay department. The symbiotes are underwhelming, and whilst the levels are just okay, they never strive to do anything more. As I said beforehand, if the Venom chapter was puzzle-oriented, then Mysterio and the symbiotes is combat-oriented. That being said, not nearly enough is done with what's on show. The first time around, I didn't even acknowledge the purpose of the furnaces because the generators blew up so easily, and the symbiotes, whilst poorly telegraphed, were easy to avoid. This chapter's biggest sin is how safe it plays everything. I was trying to recall why I had no recollection of this section despite this being one of my most replayed games of all time. I didn't like the repetitive switch pulling and barrage of lizardmen in Venom's chapter, but between the tone, latter puzzles, and final boss fight, it turns it into this mix of the best and worst. The highs and lows keep it memorable, and what's more is Venom himself. He's active throughout, and always just ahead in both cutscenes and gameplay. It feels like you're right behind him until the Lizard's Maze, where the scenario is flipped. You're no longer chasing him, but instead you're being herded. It's so impactful in building up that final fight, so to see the payoff to that being Venom noping out immediately afterwards just feels so wasted. And here, it really feels like action figures in a sandbox. A child's interpretation of a twist being, and then there was symbiotes, and then there was Mysterio. We'll get onto that in the next chapter, so let's move on. Final stretch. Mysterio did the whole, I won't tell you our evil plan, but here's my postcode and social security number. As a result, Spidey heads to the waterfront where he's encountered by the Punisher. So he's here to investigate Warehouse 65, where something is happening. He mentions that the goals might be aligned, but we're never told why he's here. In fact, he's aiming at Spider-Man to start off with, and it's immediately forgotten. After pointing Spider-Man in the right direction, he suggests that they should team up, but he's turned down and he just goes along with it. That's it. Frank Castle. He came and went with the same amount of impact as Mysterio, that being barely any at all. You know, at this point, it's telling that you could combine the dialogue from every cameo character and they'd all sound like they're coming out the same mouth. The only hint we get of Frank Castle's character is Spider-Man mentioning that they keep the death toll low by not involving him, to which he just nods his head. Call me crazy, I don't know any iteration of the Punisher that would just bow out like that. Anyways, so into the warehouse we go, and we already have more of the same. Waterfront Warehouse begins with a Stan Lee narration that tells us this will have a little more in store than even he can imagine, before immediately giving us a level identical to the Bugle's basement. I'm not joking about this, it's actually easier. Several large and open rooms with 1 or 2 generators in each. Blow them up and move to the exit. It's open to the extent where you can get through without aggroing most enemies here. The level technically serves as a transition into the underwater trench, but in the next level we come in through an air vent, and Spider-Man even says,
You gotta be kidding. Okay, recap. A couple of 100 feet underwater, electrified floors and walls, and deadly turrets pointing straight at me. Oh, my day just keeps getting better and better.
The underwater trench does switch things up with a dedicated platforming level. Don't let the aesthetic fool you. This is akin to a rooftop level. Instead of gas below, we have an electric floor. Each platform above has a laser turret as well, which we'll talk about in a moment. The point of the level is simply to get from A to B, but the turrets act as a deterrent to slow you down. You can attempt to brute force this like earlier rooftop levels, but the damage, accuracy and knockback lasers will be punishing. As such, the optimal way to proceed is to take them out one by one, whilst using the cover provided to time your swing to the next platform. Like the earlier levels, this process of doing this is simple, but it's involving, and the positioning of the platforms increases the skill required and overall challenge of the stage. The main issue I have with this is how bare it feels. The lasers by themselves are okay, but they don't change in terms of behaviour, and the only variable is their positioning. Like most levels at this point, there's no crescendo to what you've learned. It just teaches you one thing and sticks to it. The next level is Stopping the Fog, and it's another bare switch level. In fact, this may be the worst one in the game. Yeah, Sewage Plant and Hidden Switches had their time to shine. Stopping the Fog just sucks. Big open room with several locked doors surrounding a pillar. Go until the only one that's open, signified by the green sign above it, and find a black cat who's just here. Yeah, she was drugged and taken away by a serial killer, only to be locked up in a glass tube. She and Spider-Man have super strength, and not one of them decides to attempt a breakout. Instead, she tells us to shut down the power to rescue her. We do this by pressing 4 switches, one to unlock every other door, and the other 3 to close the exhaust ports, releasing the gas, which Spider-Man theorizes will overload the power as well. Of course, this neglects one other factor. Overloading the exhaust ports will cause it to explode. The whole base, to be exact. The whole base on the waterfront of a populated city. No calculation was made to how large the explosion would be, or whether or not the ignited gas would dissipate so easily. Spider-Man simply took one look at the situation and thought, for the greater good, before potentially destroying New York in the process. Don't worry, Frank the Punisher Castle. We aim to keep the death toll low.
Commence primary ignition.
Narrative aside, the level is weak gameplay-wise as well. Symbiotes are located around the centre of the room, but their aggro range is short. We can easily web swing and every door is open anyways. To recap, you walk into this room, go to the only door that's open, you're told to press all the switches in the area, which are all brightly signposted, so finding them isn't an issue, do so, and then you move on. What makes this better is that this is both the final normal level of the game and the last mention of the fog in the entire narrative. It's insane because it seems so easy to amend, right? Just have a line somewhere from someone, literally anyone, to explain that the fog was there to keep everyone indoors and to limit the resistance to the symbiote invasion. That's it.
There are more of them? You fool! There will be more than you can imagine. That fog which blankets the city is preparing everyone in New York for symbiosis!
This stings even more than you might know because the fog plotline was the most prominent outside of the imposter narrative. They were both established in the introductory cutscene of the game, and now they've both been dropped for a symbiote invasion that started 20 minutes before said end of game. Sorry, I was talking about the wrong Spider-Man game there for a second. Oh no. Oh no. Right then, this is it! The grand finale! Spider-Man vs. Carnage! Spider-Man vs... Oh hey, I forgot Ock was here. So then, Spaghetti Boy, what's your plan?
Symbiotes. No one.
I need not control the symbiote, Spider-Man.
Doc Ock.
We will work as one. It is a new world. Humanity needs the skills that my technology will give them. Symbiosis is the only way.
We'll do it all. Everything. Oh look, he's Venom. By Venom. Okay, big fight scene. So, how does it play out? 4 switches around the room that lower one by one. They create a barrier that you can just jump over once activated, and then when they're all activated, you can beat Doc Ock up. As long as you're moving, he can't hit you. Okay. Yeah, it's the worst fight in the game. I don't even know if the term fight covers it. His reach is pathetic, he takes barely any health off of you, and even if he did, health and web pickups are everywhere. They respawn constantly in this level. The fight boils down to wait for a switch to lower, activate said switch, move to the next switch, rinse and repeat, punch Ock, do it again. One of Spider-Man's smartest foes, ladies and gentlemen, built an underwater lab without anyone noticing after faking his reformation, made a fog machine that could cover all of New York, an entire fucking city, apart from 2 small areas of course, somehow agreed to Carnage's plan to turn everyone into a symbiote, despite it meaning him losing his free will as well, and then getting beaten the crap out of. His excuse is that symbiosis is the only way. Are you fucking high? How did Carnage even talk him into this? I'm sorry, the only way? To what? For what? What? Okay, so Carnage beats the crap out of Venom, forcing us to engage with him in a room with a sonic bubble. It's explained briefly that Ock must have set this up to keep Carnage in check, but lest we forget about the infinitely spawning symbiotes. One bubble ain't gonna help you, Doc, especially when your plan is to turn the world into their hosts. I like this fight. Carnage is a powerhouse, but he's quick to stun. Time it right and get a combo on him that lands him in a sonic bubble, and he'll take damage. Rinse and...
I took care of your little buddies. Now I'm gonna take care of you. You can't beat me with this. I'm already at full health. You can't beat me with this.
We're nearly done here. Carnage leaves Cletus in an attempt to escape as Spider-Man basks in his glory. The base is about to explode, you moron. Sorry. So Carnage combines with Doc Ock, turning him into... Oh, come on. Fucking Monster Ock. Really? That's the name you went with. Dr. Carnage was right there. His design is even lacking. Give him the lab coat. Why does he have abs now? The final level is a chase sequence, and it's really the effect that sells it. Otherwise, it's an incredibly scripted one-way path to the end that requires little more than jumping and web-swinging. The scenario ends with Carnage escaping from Ock for some reason, and then... Okay, Captain America comes in a superjet to save us. Black Cat left you to get help, and, I quote, she called Captain America. I'm happy with the fact that she got someone, anyone, but this is just Marvel bingo at this point. We saw Johnny Storm before, so they could have rounded things off with the Fantastica. Was it because he was A for America on her call list? It's fine. It's over now. We get a goofy scene to round things off where Scorpion tells us he wasn't in on the plan and said plan was stupid. He's right about the plan being stupid, but A, that's lampshading, and B, declaring that he wasn't involved means that his attack on the Bugle was just a coincidence. Should I even be mentioning the fact that Daredevil, who's blind, is playing cards, and no one brings that up? The very existence of that happening could be taken as a joke, but it's not addressed. So I really don't know if it is or an oversight. I would have guessed if the plot made any sense whatsoever. How about the fact that the Punisher is sitting side by side with Daredevil, Captain America, and Spider-Man, whilst Black Cat is just dancing with the Human Torch? Yes, Captain America and Daredevil, the two most righteous characters in the Marvel Universe, both with careers in maintaining legal justice, are having a party, a social party, with an assassin and a cat burglar. Let's wrap this up. You have noticed that the narrative earlier omitted quite a lot from what this game had to offer. To repeat it momentarily, Eddie and the Jade Syndicate's involvement stayed the same, but their intentions were different. We gave a reason for Scorpion's appearance, along with several arcs for Eddie, Venom, Peter, MJ, characterization for Jonah Jameson, and setting up Carnage's plot to be more direct with Peter's double life whilst maintaining things in a manner that makes sense for his character. In the process, we removed Black Cat, Daredevil, Johnny Storm, Rhino, and Mysterio. So much of the narrative is purely there for fan service, which works for an audience that doesn't care for a well-crafted story, but the thing is, I really didn't take too long to come up with my iteration. Once again, it can be poked full of holes, and it's not nearly as fleshed out as would be appropriate, but at least events travel in a way that's logical for all of the pieces rather than just, and then Rhino appeared. Black Cat appears as a friend to Peter, but her involvement could have easily been written out. She's not needed as a motivator for Peter to save New York City, so it's weird that the only narrative function she serves is that. The opportunity for her to appeal to Spider-Man's darker side whilst the world is out to get him feels ripe, but instead she does not have a personality of any kind. Daredevil appears to see if Spider-Man is truly innocent and then promises to spread the word, whilst Johnny Storm appears to act as reassurance for Peter's character and his motivation. The thing is, they can both be condensed down into J. Jonah Jameson, trying to protect Peter and be more impactful due to a personal and direct history between them. What's more powerful? Daredevil showing up to prove that a well-known friendly neighbourhood Spider-Man isn't a crook, whilst the Human Torch tells Spidey that he'll get the bad guys if he just tries hard enough. Or JJ, someone who's actively publishing propaganda against Spider-Man, coming to terms that Peter's innocence is more important and realises that Spider-Man might be the only one who can help him. In one swoop, we've erased 3 cardboard cutouts and replaced them with a substantially more meaningful moment, developing and fleshing out both JJ for his respect and care over Peter, and doing the same for Peter himself by showcasing what even the civilian side of Parker means to the world. Frank Castle's involvement could even showcase this by Peter seeing no other choice than to unmask, proving to the Punisher of all people that he's innocent. He then leaves due to his moral code now that lines have been blurred. Castle may be a killer, but he's not going so far as to gamble on an innocent person's life. A small cameo that once again fleshes out Peter whilst adding to the world in a meaningful way. Rhino serves as a means to remove Black Cat from the picture, but we've already proven that she's not needed for this plot to function, so Rhino can go too without damaging a single thing. Next up is Mysterio, who you could just about squeeze in an earlier appearance as a sort of misdirect for Spider-Man given his smoke and mirrors routine. Maybe suggest that Quentin Beck's just recently been released from prison, giving us reason to suspect him. That being said, by making the imposter Carnage, and his disguise being Peter instead of Spider-Man, including the alternative take that we've discussed with Venom's character earlier, you make him far more imposing as an overarching villain who's efficiently touched and in some way tainted every aspect of Peter's life. So, how does Doc Ock fit into the new narrative? Have Carnage possess him from the start. That's your big twist. It would explain Ock's fascination with spreading the symbiote chaos instead of just, ha ha ha, I am evil, lol. You can even reuse the scene from the start and show that Ock was really reformed, but in a blind panic when encountering Peter, Eddie, and Venom, Carnage separates from Cletus, who wants nothing to do with them, and instead Carnage takes over Ock. If you wanted to go an extra step, have Cletus be the one imprisoned at the end. Showcase that Spider-Man leaves no one behind, as his sense of justice and morality is stronger than watching a serial killer die. Funny, considering that Spider-Man did in fact leave Cletus to die. This is all to say that you can use the wider Marvel Universe in stories like this. In fact, I wish some later titles did this more. The problem is when they just cram that stuff in for the hell of it, or removed it completely. Spider-Man is often seen as the emotional core and heart of this universe, and I honestly believe that any inclusion of other characters and properties should make use of this as much as possible, instead of just throwing this cast away for the sake of a few walrus claps. The narrative is terrible, top to bottom. It exists for people who like to stare at shiny objects and only shiny objects. The performances are top-notch across the board, but that just makes them feel cheated. We seriously got the Lizard's Maze in this mess. That's just insane to me. If you have a single ounce of self-worth, you'd only play this game for the gameplay. It's incredibly ambitious when it wants to be, and I'd even say that most of it holds up today. Swing over and under New York with mechanics that have this deliberateness about them. You have to plan out your next action before making it. Those first 4 chapters have some great levels overall. It's the bulk of the game, and I'll say that the broader focus of later entries on having an open city does appease the swinging aspect, but I can't think of too many Spider-Man games that feel as sprawling as this one. Rooftops, bank complexes, being chased as New York is exploding beneath you with the sewers throughout the Bugle, above and below, and finally within an underwater lab. The open world of New York in later games may complement those titles better, but it's contending with one major set location. It feels like if this was a well-written title, it would still stand as the most Hollywoodish action game out of the lot, pushing Spidey to his limits in every environment the city can provide. For the most part, it does get that right. The transition from your standard thugs to military-grade mercenaries to mutated lizardmen then symbiotes feels natural. The roster of villains are escalated at an even pace to the point where Doc Ock and Carnage combining seems like a natural endpoint when it would otherwise be too bombastic for where the game starts. Combat is as basic as beat-em-ups get, but it's the scenarios that system is placed in that allows it to excel. Webbing Jade Syndicate members or beating up lizardmen off of a moving train along with the sound design does give the system some weight, even when the more mundane levels don't provide enough of a challenge. Beating Doc Ock is incredibly bare bones in comparison to everything that came before, but the feedback when pummeling him is still great and as good as it gets in this game. It's really the mission objectives, narrative, and overall incentive to do the smallest things like beat up an enemy that holds this game back. And it's a shame that it's noticeable to a fault, quite a large fault. That being said, we're not done just yet. The credits may have descended, but there's still a wealth of content here. We'll start with the small stuff and work our way from there, because I was taken aback by how much this title has to offer post-game. In fact, I'd be willing to say that Spider-Man 2000 has a better post-game than most modern games. For starters, the main collectibles come in the form of comics. Whilst most can just be found with a little exploration, others require you to experiment with each level. And I wouldn't consider any comic too obscure to get. For starters, the Scorpion fight only has furniture to interact with outside of the fight itself, so simply destroying said furniture will reveal a comic for the level. There are 32 in total, and they're fairly simple to get in a single run. Don't worry if you can't, because you'll be going through this title a few more times to get the most out of it. This is mainly due to the costumes you can unlock, most with an accompanying ability. Scarlet Spider and Ben Reilly are gained by beating Rhino and Venom for the first time, but they don't offer anything special because of them being gained prior to beating the game. It's a fair cosmetic reward, and it still forces the player to go through the game and face its challenges to reap the best rewards. For example, the symbiote suit can be gained by beating the game and will grant the player unlimited webbing and a small boost in damage. Go through the game again and you can unlock Spider-Man Unlimited from the titular show, who will unlock a stealth ability that'll actually work on regular enemies. Beat the game on hard and you'll unlock Captain Universe, who has everything: unlimited webbing, extra damage, invincibility. Honestly, this one is worth it just for the challenge alone, but if the player beats the game on hard from the get-go, it kind of undermines everything that came before it, suit-wise. And the effort of getting that Spider-Man Unlimited suit kind of falls flat as well. I suppose if you're short on comics and need to go back, it makes the trip easier. Speaking of comics, nabbing them all grants you Spider-Man 2099, which deals double damage. That's 3 suits that deal double damage. The thing is, the effort and reward of receiving any of these before the others is worth it. Once you've gained something like the Captain Universe costume, on the other hand, it does make the preceding suits more cosmetically incentivized rather than anything else. Still, at the minimum, it would only require one more run on hard mode and another on any difficulty you choose. You could argue that gaining the Captain Universe costume and doing another run to sweep up the rest is cathartic in a way, due to you using a reward you've worked to gain as a way of finishing up the game in a satisfying power fantasy kind of way. That being said, Peter Parker and the Quick Change Spidey costumes require you to do something a little different to the others. The game has a challenge mode entitled Training, and its 5 modes act as a decent time waster. You're scored on each, and honestly, between that and the motivation to raise your skill level for the game is enough to justify this mode's existence. In order to unlock each challenge, you have to run through the game once. This is largely to avoid spoilers when it comes to enemy types and level layouts. It keeps you coming back, but there's nothing to stop you from waiting until the end to tackle these. In Time Attack, you wail on enemies until the time limit is up. Survival mode has you going against waves until you're out for the count. Speed training has you travelling towards a marked area as fast as you can. Target Practice has you web cardboard cutouts in a shooting gallery fashion. Item Collection has you collecting spider totems as fast as possible. Get the first set in under 55 seconds to gain access to Craven's hideout for the Peter Parker costume. Zipline Challenge has you starting on the ceiling and dropping down to collect spider totems in a bungee jump fashion. The catch is you can't hit the floor. Get 10,000 points to get the quick change costume. They're each a decent time waster once again, and the rewards and Easter eggs in each are worth the time you should go looking for them. They're good in a way of getting used to the game's mechanics, hence the title training. Entering the appropriate cheat code will enable What If mode. Personally, this makes up for a lot. Going through the game once, only to be met with the nonsense of the main narrative. Worse, but here's why. What If goes nuts with its premise. A scenario where anything can happen at any moment. But, you know, in a creative fashion rather than whatever the hell that show was doing. It starts small, with a scene explaining why Johnny Storm is too busy to help out, and then you start seeing things like Ghost Rider driving down the building, Mysterio with a rubber ducky in his helmet, and then you get moments like this. So it turns out, when it leans into the absurd, the main narrative kind of feels like a joke as well. It all starts to gel with the insanity. That doesn't intentionally improve the main narrative, but it certainly unintentionally created a parody of itself that worked at getting plenty of laughs out of me. I'd recommend going through the game once before you try this, but the reward is worth it, trust me. So that was Neversoft Spider-Man. The nostalgic factor is strong for a lot of people when it comes to a title like this. Tends to blind most to the actual quality of the game itself. But I think that this is more than worth a look at. It's an easy recommend on the gameplay side of things. The narrative is only worth it on an artificial level. It's as good as looking at a deck of top trump cards. If you want something deeper, then I'd probably recommend looking elsewhere, but it's hard not to see this as a mixed bag overall. That being said, its short playtime and extra content that succeeds the base game makes this title worth coming back to, like I have done for this. So yeah. Do that.